The Vedanta philosophy of India has, since the ancient rishis who composed the Upanishads thousands of years ago, up to modern day teachers of the same tradition, maintained one central belief: the self, or Atman. But what is the Atman? The teachers of the Vedanta have always believed that behind our bodies and even behind our mind, there is an observer, an underlying awareness. This awareness is eternal, everlasting, and even transcends our body after it dies, to then go on and inhabit another body, just like how we wear new clothes after taking off the older ones. This underlying awareness, as per the teachers of Vedanta, is the Atman. Shockingly, however, there is another tradition, also born in India, which has always denied this very belief. This tradition began with Gautam Buddha over 2500 years ago. The Buddha is believed to have said that there was no such transcendental everlasting self. Indeed, this teaching of his was to be called anātman, literally no self, in direct opposition to the Vedanta philosophy. And so, we have two long and well respected traditions, both of them with deep roots in ancient India, which seem to say the complete opposite thing. Well, what is it then? Who do we believe? Is there a self, an eternal underlying awareness behind the body and the mind? Or is there no such self? Does this mean we must reject one of these two traditions? Or perhaps, is it possible that both traditions are correct from their own perspective? Is it possible to accept both the Vedantic Atman and the Buddhist anātman? In this video, we will dive deeper into the philosophies of both Vedanta and Buddhism. We will take you on a journey from the time of the Upanishads, over 2500 years ago, to the Buddha, to the philosophy of his followers, 1000 years later, then to the spread of Advaita Vedanta across the Indian subcontinent, and finally to modern day saints like Sri Ramakrishna Paramhamsa. We will describe both the Vedantic and the Buddhistic position on the existence of the Atman in detail. Then, in homage to the Buddha's teachings of the middle path, we too will try to find a middle path between these two philosophies, a solution to this question which may be acceptable to both traditions. Later in this video, we will also answer a controversial question. Was Gaudapada, the Hindu philosopher who Adi Shankaracharya called his supreme guru, actually a Buddhist? The teachings of Vedanta are most clearly expressed in two texts, the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, the very name Vedanta, which means the end of the Vedas, come from the fact that this is the philosophy based on the Upanishads, the texts which are located at the end of the Vedas, the holy scriptures of Hinduism. The teachings of the Upanishads would be well known to our regular viewers, so we will only summarize them here. The Upanishads tell us that behind our bodies and minds there is an eternal observer, the self, Atman. Indeed, behind the whole observable universe there is an underlying consciousness in which this universe appears. This universal consciousness is called Brahman. What then is the relation between Atman and Brahman? Different schools within Vedanta disagree on this central question, but the most popular and influential school within Vedanta, which is known as Advaita Vedanta, says that Atman and Brahman are ultimately the same. They are not two, or Advaita in Sanskrit. Hence, the individual self is ultimately the same as the universal self. There is no ultimate difference between the consciousness which observes the life of a single individual and the universal consciousness which manifests this whole external universe of objects. To establish this teaching of the self, the philosophers of Advaita Vedanta, like the 8th century Hindu sage Adi Shankara, rely on some great sayings, Mahavakya from the Upanishads. They recognize 4 of these sayings, all of them found in different Upanishadic texts, as follows. 1. Tattvam asi, you are that. The Advaita Vedantins interpret this to mean you, the individual self, Ātman, or that, the universal self, Brahman. 2. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. Here, I is interpreted to mean the Ātman. 3. Prajnanam Brahma, consciousness is Brahman. 4. I am Atma Brahma, this self, Atman, is Brahman. To conclude this section, we should understand that Upanishads, which contained all of the above statements, were the output of spiritual visions. The rishis, the ancient sages who composed the Upanishads, actually experienced these truths. They came face to face with nameless, formless, pure consciousness and realized that this pure consciousness was at the foundation of both their own being as well as the whole universe. But later Vedantic philosophers thought they may have had their own spiritual experiences, primarily only interpreted the experiences of the rishis and created philosophical systems on the basis of their interpretation. Hence, we should understand that the tradition of Advaita Vedanta is only one interpretation of the spiritual experiences recorded in the Upanishads. After attaining enlightenment, Gautam Buddha traveled across northern India for over 40 years, spreading his practical message, which revolved around the removal of suffering. His teaching was based on recognizing three aspects of experience. 1. Dukkha. Everything is suffering. This is the recognition that everything in life is marked by suffering, by an inherent dissatisfaction. This led to the conclusion that nothing in this world can provide us with true happiness. And why is that? It is because even those things which seem to provide us with happiness won't stay with us forever. This leads us to the second aspect of existence. 2. Anitya. Everything is impermanent. The Buddha argued that there is nothing which is transcendental or everlasting in this world. In fact, by anitya, the Buddha also meant everything changes, nothing ever stays the same. We can see how the first and second aspects are directly related to each other. Everything in life is unsatisfactory because any satisfaction we derive from worldly pleasures will not last. The dukkha, which is inherent in the world, must be realized when we witness the truth of anitya. When we eat something really delicious, or when we meet a romantic partner whom we find exciting, we know that we can't just go on eating forever, and that initial excitement of the lover will inevitably fade away. But most of us live in ignorance of this truth, which is why we fall for the trap of desires again and again. The enlightened person, under the Buddhist view, considers all desires to be unsatisfactory because they are impermanent and hence unable to cause permanent happiness. Hence, the enlightened being ceases to desire anything at all. But then we must ask, if everything is impermanent, what is the true nature of the world? What is the nature of our own self, the observer, who looks outside himself and realizes that everything is impermanent? Anātman. Everything is without a self. Anātman is, in fact, a direct outcome of the second aspect of existence, anitya. Anātman is the principle of impermanence applied to ourselves. We too are impermanent. Hence, there is no permanent self, Atman, in this impermanent world. We are just as impermanent as the things as we observe. Here we must observe that it is only this third aspect of existence, anātman, that Vedanta and Buddhism seem to differ with each other. Even Vedantic texts agree that everything in this world, samsara, is full of suffering. In fact, Krishna even repeats the first two aspects discussed by Buddha in the famous verse of Bhagavad Gita. Anityam asukham lokam imam prapya bhajasvamam. Having come to this world of impermanence and suffering, worship me. Here we see Krishna and the Buddha both agree on two aspects of existence, that it is full of suffering and impermanent. Where they appear to differ is only in the Buddha's teaching of anātman. But what really is this teaching? Did Buddha really tell his followers that there was no self? This requires us to investigate the Buddha's teaching in greater depth. A typical Buddhist response to the Vedantic self is that this whole belief in a self is just a manifestation of clinging to samsara. But the whole point of Buddhism is to attain nirvana, to go beyond samsara. So, at least apparently, it would seem as if the Buddhist belief in non self is the complete opposite of the Vedantic belief in the self. This was recognized by one of the most learned monks of the Ramakrishna order, Swami Sarvapriyananda, in one of his talks on the Vedantic self and the Buddhistic non self. But in this lecture, Sarvapriyananda also questioned the typical idea of the Buddhist narrative and asked, did Buddha ever say explicitly that there is no self? In fact, one finds as one reads the earlier texts of the Pali canon, which records the Buddha's teachings to his followers, that the Buddha chose to remain silent on such questions. This silence is found in an important early Buddhist text, the shorter discourse with Malunkyaputta. In this text, a monk by the name of Malunkyaputta wonders to himself, is the world eternal or not? Is the universe finite or infinite? Is the soul the same as the body or is it different? Does the Buddha exist after death or does he not? The Buddha has taught us the way to remove suffering, but he has not told us the answer to any of these important questions. I shall go and ask him these questions, and if he cannot answer them, I will leave the Buddhist order. And so, Malunkyaputta goes to the Buddha and asks these questions, but the Buddha refuses to answer them. Instead, he replies, what, Malunkyaputta, did I ever say to you? Come, lead the spiritual life under me, and I will declare these things to you. Thus, Buddha refused to answer any of these questions and reminded the monk that he had never even offered to answer these questions. All that the Buddha had ever taught was suffering, its origin, its removal, and the path to its removal. The Four Noble Truths. Later in this text, the Buddha also gives his famous metaphor of the arrow. The story goes as follows, as told by the Buddha himself. Suppose a man was struck by an arrow thickly smeared with poison. His friends and relatives would get a surgeon to treat him. But the man then said, I won't extract this arrow from my body as long as I don't know the caste of the man who wounded me, his name and clan, whether he is tall or short, the color of his skin, and of what village or city he comes from, whether the bow was straight or curved, and so on. That man would still not have learned these things, and meanwhile he would die. This story, narrated by the Buddha, is intended to be a direct response to Malunkyaputta, who is none other than this wounded man. The wounded man has been hit by a poisonous arrow. His first response should be to remove the arrow from his chest and save his life. Instead, the man questions, who shot the arrow? Why was the arrow shot? And what is the poison inside the arrow? Similarly, Malunkyaputta and all of us today live in a world which consists of suffering and impermanence. The poisoned arrow. Instead of removing the arrow by removing suffering from our lives, we ask ultimate questions about existence, like who created the world? Is it eternal? And also, is there a self? For the Buddha, then, a person obsessed with the question, is there a self or no self, is clinging to this desire for ultimate answers about the universe. What is more important, instead, is to abandon this clinging, to stop this questioning, and actually experience the removal of suffering in our lives. The Buddha, after narrating the story, also tells Malunkyaputta why he has not agreed or disagreed to any of these views. He says, and why haven't I declared these things? Because they aren't beneficial or relevant to the fundamentals of spiritual life. They don't lead to disillusionment, dispassion, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. And what have I declared? I have declared the Four Noble Truths. This is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. And why have I declared only these things? Because they are beneficial and relevant to the fundamentals of the spiritual life. So, Malunkya Putta, you should remember what I have not declared as undeclared, and what I have declared as declared. Here we can see that the Buddha is in fact telling Malunkya Putta not to be distracted by the questions about the nature of the universe and about the nature of our own self, including the existence or non-existence of the Atman. Instead, he is telling Malunkya Putta to focus on the removal of suffering in his own life. But importantly, the Buddha also says that believing in any of these ultimate positions about the universe, known as metaphysical beliefs, does not help us in living a spiritual life, which is what actually matters if our ultimate goal is enlightenment. What does this mean? The Buddha seems to imply here that having either the belief that the self and the body are different or that the self and the body are the same would both be problematic. If we believe that we are an eternal, everlasting self, we will learn to believe that we are actually immortal. We don't die when our bodies die, but we live on in the self. This feeling of immortality, according to the Buddha, is actually just us clinging to the world. This is criticized by the Buddha as a form of eternalism, a clinging to the desire of external existence, a fear of death. But on the other hand, if we were to vehemently deny the self and constantly tell ourselves that there is no self, or even that there is nothing in the world, this only reveals another kind of clinging. This was criticized by the Buddha as a form of annihilationism, a clinging to the desire for non-existence, which is still a desire for escape from the world because one does not wish to stay in it. The Buddha instead taught the teaching of the middle path or the middle way. This teaching was to become an essential part of Buddhist philosophy down the ages, as we will see in the teachings of one of the greatest Buddhist philosophers, Nagarjuna. The middle path, according to the Buddha, is the way that avoids two extremes, both of which only represents opposite desires. Here, the Buddha would say that to attain enlightenment, it is essential to take the middle path between the opposing views of eternalism and annihilationism. Hence, we must not have either the desire for eternal existence or the desire for non-existence. We should have no desire at all and be completely neutral towards our existence. This complete neutrality to existence, according to the Buddha and later Nagarjuna, can only be achieved by the renunciation of all views about the world and even about ourselves. These philosophical views, like the existence of the self, do not help us in our spiritual life. They make us cling to the world and to a possible immortality, even when we know that everything that is born must die. The only reason for having any views whatsoever, then, is if they help us advance in our spiritual life. We have seen that the Buddha remained silent for many philosophical questions. This tells us that knowing the answers to these questions will not help us. Now, some of you may ask, the Buddha has given at least some answers. He has told us dukkha, anitya, anātman, suffering, impermanence, non-self. Aren't these also philosophical positions? Yes, that's correct. The Buddha told us about these three philosophical truths, and only these three, because they help us progress towards enlightenment. While dukkha and anitya teach us not to cling to this impermanent world which is full of suffering, the third aspect, anātman, teaches us not to cling to ourselves, to recognize that we are subject to birth and death. But then you may reply, isn't anātman something that the Buddha denied by his silence to Malunkya Putta? Doesn't the middle path mean that both the belief in the self, Ātman, as well as the belief in the non-self, anātman, must be denied? This leads us to an important issue related to the Buddhist doctrine of non-self. It can be argued that anātman is simply a denial of the self in terms of belief. However, anātman does not imply the opposite belief, the belief in no self. In other words, the Buddhist doctrine of no self is just a reminder to us that there is no single underlying ego behind us which will live on after we die. The belief in such an ego would, after all, only increase our desires, our self-worth, our sense of grandeur about ourselves. But on the other hand, if we believed that there is no self or nothing in the whole world, we would in fact believe in nihilism, a materialistic world where nothing exists after death, and in fact, nothing matters. This perspective also would not help us spiritually. Why would we do things like meditation and other spiritual practices if we don't exist after death? Despite all the philosophical depth we have discussed here, the conclusion is simple. Anātman is not a belief in no self, but instead a belief in the middle path between these two positions, the denial of both self and no self. Anātman is the Buddhist silence and not a materialistic denial of life after death. The philosophical depth of Buddha's middle path was brought out by the great Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna in his teachings. Hence, Nagarjuna became the founder of the Madhyamika path of Buddhism, where Madhyamika literally means the school which follows the middle path. According to Nagarjuna, everything in the world, including ourselves, were characterized by emptiness, shunyata. But what does it mean for all things to be empty? We would be incorrect if we were to interpret shunya as nothing. This would go against the Buddha's middle path and imply a turn towards nihilism, the view that nothing truly exists. Nagarjuna cautions us against viewing shunyata as nothing. Nagarjuna explains shunya instead as that which lies beyond the realm of all logic. He uses a logical technique known as chatushkoti, a four-cornered system of argumentation. In ordinary Western logic, in response to questions like, does the self exist? We respond either yes or no. But in the chatushkoti, we have four possible responses. 1. The self exists. Yes. 2. The self does not exist. No. The self both exists and does not exist. Yes and no. The self neither exists nor does not exist. Neither yes nor no. According to Nagarjuna, the ultimate truth of all existent things, shunya, is beyond all four options. Hence, even on the issue of the self, the Buddhist does not just say the self does not exist, but actually denies all these four options. Nagarjuna's logic is in this sense just another way of explaining the Buddha's silence. But then, what exactly is ultimate reality? The Indian philosopher T.R.V. Murthy in his book, The Central Philosophy of Buddhism, interpreted Nagarjuna as implying that there is an underlying essence of the world which is beyond the confines of rational logic. Hence, we can say absolutely nothing about that ultimate reality, not even that it exists. Most shockingly, the logic of Nagarjuna is used by Gaupada, the founder of Advaita Vedanta tradition. In his commentary on the Mandukya Upanishad, the Mandukya Karika, in a passage in this text, Gaupada writes as follows: by asserting that the self exists, does not exist, exists and does not exist, or again, neither exists nor does not exist, the non-discriminating man does certainly cover it, the self, up through ideas of changeability, unchangeability, existence and non-existence. This is shockingly similar to Nagarjuna's own thinking, just stated in different terms. For Nagarjuna, the underlying essence of all things, emptiness, is beyond all logic. Similarly, for Gaudapada, it is the self, Ātman, which is beyond all logic, even the logic of existing or not existing. Hence, saying anything at all about the self would be incorrect. The self is ultimately anirvachanya, ineffable. This is because the notions of something existing or not existing are only seen in empirical reality. In the absolute reality, however, where concepts, notions, and even language do not exist, nothing at all can be said about the self. Here we see a return to the Buddha's silence in the earliest philosopher of Advaita Vedanta. Over 1,000 years after Gaupada, Sri Ramakrishna recognized the importance of the Buddha's silence. In a passage from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we find the following discussion. Narendra, the future Swami Vivekananda, said, "He, the Buddha, could not express in words what he realized by his tapasya, spiritual practice. So people say he was an atheist." Sri Ramakrishna, he was not an atheist. He simply could not express his inner experiences in words. Why should the Buddha be called an atheist? When one realizes one's swarupa, the true nature of oneself, one attains a state that is something beyond asti, is, and nasti, is not. The experience of the Buddha is beyond both existence and non-existence. It is fascinating to observe that Sri Ramakrishna, without any formal study of Buddhist philosophy, understood the Buddha's silence so effectively, and even related it to the question of self and no self. The truth is, nothing at all can be said about the self's existence or non-existence. The ultimate truth is beyond such concepts. Enlightenment lies between is and is not. Where does this leave us as spiritual practitioners? Should we believe in the self or no self? Through this overview of Vedantic and Buddhist philosophy, we have developed one takeaway. It doesn't necessarily matter what you believe, whether you believe in the self or not. Spiritual practice still remains possible. If you believe in the self, then you can understand the Buddhists' no self doctrine as a warning against the ego. The ego, our sense of I, is the empirical self associated with our name and form, our likes and dislikes. The self of Vedanta, however, is the ultimate self, beyond all names and forms. So importantly, both Vedanta and Buddhism are united in being against the identification with the ego. And so, this implies that regardless of whether we believe in the ultimate self or not, our first step should be to get rid of the empirical self, the ego, which surely dies with our bodies, whether or not there is an ultimate self which lives after our death. This emphasis on first getting rid of the ego instead of worrying about questions like the ultimate self would be in line with the practical teachings of the Buddha. Even the Vedanta philosophy, as we have seen, agrees that the ultimate self is beyond the understanding of ordinary logic. So let us focus on practical spiritual progress and leave questions about the ultimate nature of reality for later. What do you think about self and no self? Do you believe in either of these positions? Let us know in the comments below.